Welcome to the New America Foundation. We are a DC-based think tank, a policy institute here inside the Beltway, but today we are actually co-sponsoring an event with GigaOM, which is at gigaom.com. And so we have sort of a West Coast virtual contingent that will be providing questions and taking part, as personified.
I'm right here. I'm not virtual.
By Stacy Higginbottom from GigaOM. We also have Amy Schatz here on your left, and Blair Levin and Craig Settles here on the right. And today's discussion actually grows out of a series of columns that Blair and Craig had posted on GigaOM. And it's interesting because I have both vociferously agreed and substantially disagreed with both of them on various issues. And I'm really excited to hear their take on things, both because I believe that where they disagree, they both have tremendous knowledge and background as to why they have disagreements. And I think there's also wide areas where they will quite rightfully agree on what needs to happen. So they'll provide sort of, I think, over the course of this discussion, a historical context as well as sort of a contemporary lay of the land. And I hope we will then get to sort of a vision for how to implement meaningful reforms, as Craig was telling us earlier, sort of how to get from here to there as well. So Amy Schatz is a reporter. A lot of you have read her work in the Wall Street Journal. She's been following the happenings here in the tech world and the telecom world for years and has done a tremendous job of it. Stacy is our token West Coaster, I guess.
From Austin.
And from Austin. All right, so she's keeping things weird here at today's discussion and is one of the key reporters for GigaOM on tech telecom issues. And I hope that we'll be seeing much more of her face here in DC over coming months and years. Blair Levin is most, I guess, notoriously and widely known.
I'm a real West Coaster since I grew up in Los Angeles. So
very good.
I'll claim that.
We won't hold that against you.
Santa Cruz, actually. So
Holy moly.
Indeed. Well, so Blair he was responsible for overseeing and coordinating the development of the National Broadband Plan. He's also, I think, for decades been an analyst looking at the state of tech and telecom in the United States. Craig Settles, I first started working with, I guess now 7-8 years ago, through community wireless, community broadband work, back when there were just a few voices in the wilderness talking about the importance of broadband and how it wasn't a luxury, it was a fundamental need in civil society in the 21st century. And I'm very glad to have him here on stage. So with that, we do have a Twitter tag. It's Broadband Plan, all one word. If you send that in, Stacy will extract it from her iPad there, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions online as well as in the audience as we progress. So with that, I want to turn it over to Craig to give some brief sort of opening remarks. We'll then go to Blair to give his own, and then we'll turn it over to sort of our co-moderators, co-MCs to take it from there.
Thank you. Thank you, Sasha. Are we live? Can we hear in the back? Okay. Thank you, Sasha, for hosting along with GigaOM, and thank you, Amy and Stacy, for moderating this, and Blair for coming together to talk about broadband strategy. This dialogue started, well, maybe I should back up for a second. As a report writer, self-proclaimed analyst, and consultant in the broadband space, I followed the broadband stimulus fairly closely, and one of the things I learned through that experience is that the road between a bill and the programs that actually touch communities is a long and winding road, and lots of things happen along that journey that can change things. And with the broadband plan, though it was mandated by Congress, isn't a bill, but it's a report that pushes in a direction. So in this particular case, that road between documents and final programs is even more winding and more susceptible to change. And what you get out the end may or may not reflect what people want or need, or very well it may, But you've got to, if you're going to be an activist, you're going to have input into this process, you've got to follow what goes on along that path. A lot of what happens in the media obviously shapes the discussion points and has an impact on that final outcome. And so in reading a number of Blair's interviews and remarks in a number of places, there are indeed a number of things that we agree on. There are a number of points in the broadband plan where we're in agreement. I picked out a number of things that I thought were significant enough that needed to be discussed because I had a different view on those. For example, a comment about 4G will possibly be more important than an increase in speed in wireline. The fact that mobility is a horizontal industry and every industry touches that, which I don't necessarily disagree per se, but there's an aspect of that I had an issue with. So anyway, so I wrote a column and I said, this is what I think, and Blair responded to that, and off we went. And so I think where we are today is, my grandmother would probably look at this and go, well, we're just two people trying to get to the same place, but we have points along the way where we go in different directions. And I just think being able to talk about this in an audience like this, as well as take questions, will help, I think, further move along the discussion about what's our best way to get broadband that's in the best interest of the most people in the country.
Well, since you started with the Beatle lyric, Long and Winding Road, I'll respond with one. You say you want a revolution. We'd all like to see your plan. I think I have that approximately right. It's a little bit wrong, but you all have seen our plan. And the most important thing to me that you all understand is the opening line of Chapter 17 on implementation. This plan is in beta and always will be. I'm only here today for one reason, that I don't think we developed the perfect plan. I think it's a long process. We worked really hard. We got a lot of things right. But I think the country has to constantly reevaluate. In any business, what you do is you throw out hypotheticals and you say, let's move forward in this direction. And then you test it against people challenging it. And that's essentially what we tried to do. Unfortunately, I have to disagree a little bit also with your comment about that media shapes it. Today, Julius is giving a speech on universal service. Tomorrow, the FCC will actually adopt an NPRM. That NPRM has some differences from what we laid out in the plan. I'm actually not sure I know what they all are, but I'm aware of some of them. None of them, in my view, have been shaped by media. They've all been shaped by a process which I think, unfortunately, has been happening very quietly. Nobody's really seen it. You haven't seen a lot of public workshops on it. You haven't seen any commissioners discuss how they wanted changes in the plan. I'm perfectly willing to accept that we didn't get it 100% right. But I would like that dialogue to be very public and transparent, and that's why I'm here with Craig. Let me say the most important thing is that we have a very clear understanding what are the problems we're trying to solve, why are they important, and what is our path to doing it. There is no path that cannot be improved through constant reevaluation and course correction. But if you don't have a clear vision of where you're going at the end, there's no way to get there. My dear friend and colleague on the broadband plan, Eric Garr, who's a sailor, used to, there would be moments where he would say, we're sailing very fast, but we have no idea where we are. And we always had to course correct in that process to make sure we actually had a vision. So what I was trying to do in response to you was constantly say, look, the criticisms are kind of generic in general, but I didn't understand what the criticism had to do with, for example, what is the minimum technical requirement we want to establish to be eligible for universal service funding for residents, for residential rural America? That's a really important question. I think the FCC will answer it probably about the way we did in the plan. That would be my guess. Despite significant criticism from rural phone companies, which I think is, on a Monday I'm doing the same thing in Dallas in front of a bunch of rural phone companies, and they'll yell at me for a couple hours, and it'll be, for me, a lot of fun. It's a weird character trait that I like that. But the important thing is that we do have a very concrete, specific discussion. And so let me just end by saying, again, We all want the revolution, but we have to have a plan, even if we have to correct it constantly.
So with that in mind, let's kind of define the revolution we're going for here.
Right.
Who do we want to put in charge? What is it, like the plan has said that we want 100 megabits per second by 2020 to 100 million homes.
Yeah.
But we also are defining broadband in there as 4 megabits per second down. But let's...
No, that's actually,
Oh,
we're
yes.
not defining, we never defined broadband.
Oh,
That's actually an important point. And
That
can I
is.
just say, the 100 megabits, that's, which I actually think that may have been one of the biggest PR mistakes that in the process, and we weren't really doing PR in the planning process. It so focused people's attention on precisely the wrong thing. It was a good goal to have, but everybody talks about it. It's completely screwed up the universal service debate because people think we're subsidizing that. That was never the intent. And there's a big difference between what you want as a compass, a north point for the country to be heading toward, and what you want to have the government subsidize. Two very different things.
and that's kind of where we're going to go. We're going to set our revolution. So, Craig, if you want to start, or Blair, actually, since what is it that we're working for? Let's talk about goal for everyone, and then let's talk about universal service, because they're kind of two different things and cost different amounts, and we're
Right.
going to be there for parts of it.
I would say the thing we're going toward is a ubiquitous, diverse, and constantly improving ecosystem of networks, applications, devices, and most importantly of all, and often very forgotten, the people who know how to use it. That's what we're going for.
And speed doesn't matter.
No, speed is an input, and when I say constantly improving, you want the network to be constantly improving in terms of speed, but you want the devices to be improving, and you want the applications to be improving. Craig and I disagree on this, but that's perfectly fine. I mean, I think going from narrowband to broadband, huge incremental gain. Going from low-speed broadband to video-capable broadband, significant gain. Beyond that, for residences, not quite clear what the gain is yet.
Okay.
For institutions, very clear gain. Wireless is now going through the same kind of thing, and I think that's why it's much more important, and also to have, there's so many technologies that are coming online that when combined with wireless, and by the way, Steve Johnson's book on innovation is fantastic in terms of showing how innovation is really a function of streams coming together, and that's what's going to happen with mobile broadband and nanotechnology and sensing technology and all kinds of other things. But it's that the important thing is you have constantly improving. I have said speed is way overemphasized in this debate, and I deeply believe it, because the real gain is in applications. I don't want to take up too much time, but let me illustrate the problem that I mean. I wrote an editorial with my colleague Eric Garr in the Journal in July talking about how we ought to replace all textbooks with e-books. There are a lot of educational reasons for that. We can talk about that later. Really important use. It would be fantastic for lots of reasons. The head of one of the rural telephone companies wrote a piece saying, this is outrageous. They want this for urban America, but they don't want this for rural America. Okay? And these, and I said, look, surely let's get together and talk about it. And we had a debate that we opened up to the press, and my first question to her was, what speed do you need to have e-textbooks work? And it is, of course, below the speed that we think all rural America could get. People should focus on the applications, how we use it. And that's where the real gain is. This, by the way, was not my initial thought, but this is what I learned through the 36 public workshops and all that kind of stuff. The real gain for our country at this moment in time is in using it better to deliver education, public safety, healthcare, etc. Speed's important. We need increases in speed. And by the way, I think we need some places to have far higher speeds than they have today. But generally speaking, and by the way, I also think Obama is exactly right. We need to get 4G everywhere. That's a really important goal. But the big upside right now, from the public perspective, is on the application, the use, and by the way, getting people who are digitally illiterate.
Craig, you kind of looked a little like you disagreed earlier on in his statement. I kind of disagree with your ebook needs, but
I'll be happy to debate that.
we can talk about that when we get to the applications. But
Well, I think that the point that is correct is that the issue of speeds has become a dominant factor in the discussion. And you're starting to polarize people, urban, rural, around that issue in many respects. What I said in one of my blog posts was that what broadband needs is a JFK. And what I meant by that was someone to articulate a vision and an outcome that is significant enough that it rallies people around and moves in that direction. And the reason that I come up with that is because when laying out a technology plan, whether it's for a business, whether it's for a local government or national government, it should all be about some need, some major outcome to be achieved or created by the folks that are using it. And if we say that our mission is to use broadband as an economic engine, which is what the president has alluded to, that changes, I think, the nature of this discussion. So you really don't get into a question about, what's the minimum speed. You don't identify a specific technology and say, we all need to have wireless or we all need to have wired. What you basically say is that this technology's biggest benefit, and according to lots of people that I talk to on an ongoing basis, economic development, both personal economic development and community business economic development, is the driver. And so if that becomes our national goal, I think it then focuses us to the things that are important. The other thing that I feel is important, and this is more of a process thing, is that there is no universal solution to each community's need. I think each community has a different set of needs. And if we set up a program that is where you're subsidizing a lot of companies to deliver, mobile technology or wired or what have you, that may or may not fit the community need. So what I feel should be the starting point of what the plan is or what USF reform is when we start to talk about that is that there is a structure by which communities define their needs and the government sets up programs that is able to respond to that.
Can I just ask a question? This is
Yes.
a really important question. Because I asked this in the blog and you never responded to it. If the communities are going to define their needs, but the money is collected and distributed by the federal government, what is the criteria by which the federal government would distribute it?
The government has to,
The federal government?
The federal government,
Okay.
needs to define a set of parameters. That goes across the board to all communities. What is your need? What is your expected outcome? Well, actually, what is your solution? First and foremost should be, what is a solution that you as a community have?
I just want to nail down this point. Does the federal government set criteria which it says, we're not going to subsidize a service unless it has this minimum criteria? You're okay with that? I think that's what
Right.
you said. We did that in the plan. We said 4 down, 1 up, actual.
Right.
Do you agree with that?
No.
Okay, what should the criteria be?
What I would say is, what's your solution?
But wouldn't their solution then be, well, if you're paying for it, I'll go with a gig?
No, it isn't. It's basically, do you want to build, you've decided as a community, what do you want broadband to do, first and foremost? So community A says, we have economic development needs and we have telehealth needs, and those are our priority. We have come up with a plan for how we can get there with broadband. We have come up with X amount of funding sources. We have defined the payback, the validity of the project, so forth and so on. To which then the government has a checklist that says, okay, does it meet a need? Does the network seem to be sustainable? Do they have technology there already? Or are they in a completely unserved area? So that the criteria, similar to how the broadband stimulus program was structured, there is a criteria, there's a checklist.
But is this institutional or is this residential?
This is both. Because if you look at a community,
So is this a replacement for the current universal service?
It's how you distribute the money through it. If Universal Service Fund has $8 billion,
Right.
which you are trying to distribute through programs,
Right.
right? What you say is, what is, again, you have a set of criteria.
Okay, but I just want to be clear about this. So you take the $8 billion, you say we're going to stop distributing it that way. We're now going to distribute it in a completely different way. That's what you're favoring?
Yes.
Okay. So you would, for example, stop distributing money to Lifeline Link-Up, which is about $1.2 billion.
You would restructure how the money is distributed through that.
But you would basically say we're going to stop that program. I just want to understand.
Right.
So we're going to take out all Lifeline Link-Up. That's what you want to do that?
Now, didn't you argue in a paper recently that you guys would take out Lifeline Link-Up and switch it over to VoIP?
But Lifeline Link-Up is a program designed to help low-income individuals.
Right.
What we said was we need to transition that from only helping low-income individuals with voice to helping them get on broadband. That's
Okay.
different.
Okay.
And in the course of that, are you basically saying that for the $10 or whatever it is per person that you subsidize per month, now instead of subsidizing your phone bill, you're going to now subsidize your broadband?
I think there's actually a lot of complexity about how to do that, but that's roughly right.
Okay.
Yeah. Now,
So-
what I understand you'd be saying is just stop that program.
No, what I would be saying is instead of giving each person a subsidy,
Yeah.
say, for example, there's 10,000 low-income people in a community.
Mm-hmm.
If I take $10 by 10,000, that's what, 100,000 a month. I would say put it together as a block.
Mm-hmm.
Have that community define some standard of broadband that makes sense for them, and then go out to the market and say, we as a community, low-income folks in whatever city this is, we want to use this money to leverage a service package, as opposed to I give someone $10 and they then get a $10 coupon off of their broadband service. Because if I've got crappy service in my area, I don't have the choice I need. If something goes wrong, I as the individual for $10 has no impact on the quality of the service and who provides that service. But if I change the program to basically turn it into a block grant, turn this into a negotiation system in which the community says we want people to compete for our money to meet these needs that we have defined. What you may come out at the end with is, for example, in San Francisco, their housing authority developed a number of wireless networks to support their various housing projects. So instead of having this $10 subsidy per person, you say, well, we've got $100,000 a month. We want to build and install something entirely different, as opposed to we just want to get a discount off of our service. So what's changing is how the program is administered, not that we just stop the program.
No, I understand. You're basically saying there are three fundamental programs, Universal Service. One is a high-cost fund,
Right.
designed to serve areas where the cost of serving because of density, et cetera, is high cost. There's a second program, which is the institutional, E-rate, rural health. And the third is to help low-income individuals. And you're saying wipe out those three programs and change it entirely to a community-based program. Okay. I just want to understand how it
Right.
works. So as to the first, I would say how much of that $8 billion should go to high-cost communities, which now, instead of subsidizing, I assume what you're saying is, instead of subsidizing a phone company because of the cost of deploying and operating a service there, you're going to give that money to the city or the community. So it's not defined by areas, it's defined by geographic structures. But you're going to do it with would you keep the criteria of 4-1, that like a community can't get any money unless they do at least a 4-1, right? That you would, I think we agreed on that as a beginning spot for residential.
Actually, I wouldn't.
Okay.
I would say to the community, what is it that you want this network to do?
Mm-hmm.
Based on what you want it to do, what's going to be the benefit to your community? You got to justify that if you put this money in, there's going to be some need. How will the wait? Let me finish. Then you decide what is the sustainability of the network?
Yeah.
Because I think this issue of subsidizing a network or subsidizing folks where it's just this constant subsidization and the network that's created doesn't sustain itself is a drain and is counterproductive. I think
Right,
it's
no,
better.
I realize, but you realize also that you're
Blair.
creating a situation in which the federal government, you're creating this massive bureaucracy in terms of block grants of where you're giving the federal government power to tell the communities. I mean, you're changing the system. Yeah, I mean, these are complicated things.
Don't doubt that.
How much money do you think it would take to solve your problem? How much money do you think we need to have in the fund?
You have what you have, and you sort of go with that. It's like saying, well, how much money are we going to put in broadband stimulus? We set out a pot of money with the understanding that this wasn't going to be all the money that's needed, but this was going to be a money that, combined with matching grants and so forth and loans and all the rest of it, are going to tackle as many problems as we can tackle.
Yeah.
So, yes, it is a radical change from how things are done. I don't disagree with that. I do, though, feel that if I give $100,000 to a community that has clearly defined all of these issues of need, sustainability, what the end product is going to be, that I will probably have a better outcome than if I continue to subsidize a business who is only going to make decisions in the best interest of that business. Mm-hmm. It's because the dynamic we have now allows the provider to deliver as good or as bad a service as they're going to deliver. If someone comes in and says, I want to be subsidized because I have given the lowest bid in this reverse auction to build a network here, and if that network doesn't turn out to work effectively for the community, well, oops, what are we going to do, ask them for the money back? We don't. The other thing is, if someone buys the company, well, then what happens to the community?
Yeah.
So it seems like one of the things that's really, that both of you are really talking about here are how to set up these networks for whatever consumers need right now. And both of you seem to have this idea that the consumers or communities understand what they need right now. What about future-proofing networks? What if you're talking about applications that it's only a glimmer in someone's eye at this point? If you're going to have 4 up, 4 down, 1 up, how do you sort of future-proof these networks as the government is spending money for these programs, no matter what way they do it?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we need a level of clarity that I don't think it's worth people's time, particularly since probably people were up late celebrating the Packers' victory, which, by the way, is a great demonstration of community power, since it is the only professional sports team owned by the community. So I'm totally in favor of that, and wish more communities had that. We should distinguish what we're talking about here. For 90% of the country, I actually disagree with you. I think for 90% of the country, there are competitive forces. They may not be as good as the competitive forces for restaurants in certain areas, but there are competitive forces which drive upgrades and drive changes in behavior. And by the way, I think one of the things that became clear as we were actually looking at the data was the country is about to go through a very interesting time because we have 2 very significant upgrades: cable DOCSIS 3 from the top, and wireless upgrading to 4G. And the most interesting question, which we do not really know the answer to, is how do the DSL providers respond to that? But that is going to be answered not by themselves, but rather by consumer behavior and applications providers, et cetera. So for 90% of the country, the subsidy that at least we thought we needed was not a community subsidy as much as it is a low-income subsidy, because the networks are there, and they're actually, when we started, I thought that cable networks weren't in low-income communities, but the data was that they're good, and they do offer that service. And there's that institutional. Schools, by the way, I think there's a lot of evidence that we are not providing sufficient bandwidth connectivity to schools as well as to medical centers, or certain medical facilities. But the question of how do we get to unserved, I just have to say, I think while your proposal is interesting, and I urge you to write it up in detail and give it to the FCC, which is looking at it, I think it would be a profound change that would actually result in more bureaucracy, actually, bizarrely, more federal control, less community control, and huge expenditures that would not be as efficient. But I'm not sure we want to get to that. I just want to say, as to the future proofing, it's a very serious problem. I think we have to be humble about what we know and what we don't know. It is one of the biggest things we struggled with in terms of designing universal service. I don't. There are some who argue that we ought to spend $300 billion to make sure that every community, and what we're really talking about here is the last 10%, has 100 megabits. I couldn't justify that.
Isn't there some middle ground, though, between 4 and 100? I mean, there's a difference between the, $8 billion a year versus the $300 billion you guys are talking about,
and
right?
by the way, it's interesting if you look at the numbers, and we did a very large model on it. If you go from 4 to 6, you double the actual cost.
And how are you guys doing this from a technology? I mean, because if I look at something like fiber, you lay fiber in the ground, that's future-proofed. You can increase that.
I agree with that.
Forever. And but fiber obviously is expensive.
Right.
But even if you look at something like DSL, fiber to the node, and you kind of gradually push it out further. So when you were talking about moving it from 4 to 6 and that creating double the cost, where was that coming from a technological standpoint? What were you envisioning in the underlying network?
The model that we did, which for anyone who's for the real geeks, this is the challenge for the real geeks.
This is the West Coast contingent right here.
You all can look it up, and you can all challenge it. And I'm not sure it's 100% right, but it was the best model the FCC had ever done. There were about 200 assumptions in it that you could see ahead of time, and everybody can look at the model and make your thing. But the big question is, and I think I would love this debate. I'll tell you where I come out on it, but I'm not sure I'm right. The big thing is if you have 4, wireless is a competitor, and that drives down the cost. If you go to 6, it's not quite clear whether wireless is a competitor. That's a big challenge. Now, the rural guys say, we need fiber, and I agree that as to for institutional uses, that's true, and we had a few proposals in there to try to do that. From rural residential, if we had all the money in the world, I'd agree, but you have to have priorities. And for those people, I have had this debate with rural guys, and they say, well, just spend more money. And I say, where's it going to come from? And they say, tax Google. I swear to God.
I believe that. But wireless, and that is a fundamental issue I think Craig and I actually share with the broadband plan.
Okay,
is
then
wireless,
how much money do you want to spend in rural America?
I have not thought about that. I mean, I personally, my tax dollars, I believe that like $100 million to connect everybody, I know that won't get you as far.
100 million, that gets you
sorry, 100 billion. 100 billion.
You'd be okay with that?
I'm okay with my tax dollars going towards broadband.
Can you find me one member of the House of Representatives or one member of the Senate who agrees with you? Just one.
I'm from Texas, so mine are really, really against this.
Well, let me jump in here for a second. I think what we need to come back to is, if your assumption is that 90% of America has the broadband that it needs, I think you need to ask the question, what is it that we want broadband to do? If all we're trying to do is solve a problem, on a checklist, well, we need to have more people connected. You just give them the least expensive thing you can give them so that they're just connected, they're in a better place today than they were in yesterday. Okay, that's fine. That's not really getting us anywhere, and in 5 years, it's going to all be obsolete. And we will have spent a lot of money, and we will have surveys coming out like the one that came out a couple of weeks ago that said, we spent money for teachers via, I'm guessing this was in response to a survey about E-rate, and teachers were saying, okay, we got $1 billion of money spent, collectively, yet we're not getting where we need to get to. And
I
if you
agree
look,
with that.
but
to school.
But see, the thing is, when that program started, it was kind of, let's give them connectivity without any of these thoughts about the future and so forth. And so we spend and we put a bunch of money in that.
I was there. And,
okay.
I have the scars on my back from the E-rate. The E-rate was the second largest new program in the Clinton administration that actually, I'm extremely proud of it. I agree. We didn't do it 100% right.
Right. But let me make my point, though, because we're getting off the track here. Okay, so my point is, if all we're going to do is just do enough to get by, in the long term, that's ridiculous. So what the president has said, what lots of communities have said, is that broadband can be an economic driver. And they have listed at the community level, these are all the things that we need to do. Right.
Okay, but you have to have a plan. You have to say how you're going to pay for it.
But
and you never answer that.
Would you let me finish?
As soon as you answer the question, sure.
Santa Maria. All right. If that is the objective. If economic development is the objective, if putting in broadband so that businesses improve their ability to do business, so that you can retrain workforce, you can train and educate people using modern technology, modern teaching software, and all the rest of that whole package of stuff, that has a technology requirement.
Right.
So the issue is, if you say you want to be here, then you somehow have to facilitate the ability to get that technology in place. If you say you want to have, this great economic achievement that will be supported in part by broadband, because broadband alone isn't going to achieve economic changes. It's going to be broadband with a number of programs. But if you don't have the right technology, yet you say you want to achieve this end, you're not going to achieve that end. I mean,
So what's the criteria?
So the criteria comes back to, what do people need to get to where they need to get to, and how can the government be part of that solution? It comes back to the program I talked about. If the idea is to have broadband be a way to get low-income people out of their current economic situation, a $10 a month subsidy for them to get a break on their broadband is not it. You aggregate that money and you give the community the power to basically negotiate with providers of various types. You will get a solution that makes sense. Now, you may not be able with the USF funds available to solve all of America's problems, the same way that the broadband stimulus didn't cover everyone's need. But at least where that money goes, it has an impact that is better than the current system. I'm looking at something that is better than where we are by focusing on achieving something that is greater than what we have. And I watched this in 2005. In 2005, when Muni Wireless was all the rage, politicians in almost every city in America was, we are going to raise up the level of our economic development in our communities, and we're going to do it with Wi-Fi. Because in their mind, that was the be-all and end-all. And Wi-Fi wasn't up to the task. But the problem was, people sunk money into that. Fortunately, more private businesses than cities did, but nevertheless, the outcome was the same. We spent a bunch of money to build a bunch of networks that in the end were nowhere near effective for what people said they want to get.
Okay, so because basically, to sum it, I'm just going to sum it up, and we're going to kind of take this to the next level, hopefully. You're talking about giving money for the best broadband, or the communities deciding what broadband they want or need. I'm imagining most of them would probably go with fiber or something higher than 4 megabits.
And that's not necessarily the right assumption, but,
right. But okay.
It will be a lot of people's assumption.
So we will leave out some of the low-income people, because we're changing the program to give these grants to communities as opposed to spreading it out across the nation.
No, it's based on low-income individuals. If it's a low-income fund, it would go toward.
But if you give it to communities, you're only going to have $8 billion to spread across X number of communities.
That's true. And those would be the most rural. So you're switching more money to rural.
Okay. And so that's kind of your argument, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Are you happy?
Because what I'm looking at now is, we are subsidizing telecom companies, either large or small, some dollar amount that for the individual may have zero impact.
Right. In
the collective for that community. If I've got, again, 10,000 low-income people in the community, I will have spent $10 per person for 10,000 people every month, and will have minimum impact. Right. But what we say is But what we're saying is, we want to spend this money, right, to improve their economic condition.
Right.
Well, if you want to do that, then you got to change how this thing works. And if you change how it works, yes, there are different people who are going to lose in this case.
Right.
Their money is not going to go as far as you would like.
Okay, we got that. And I want to move us a little deeper into the discussion. Now, with you're talking about keeping it much the same, or. No. Well, okay, so let's get your position here. But I also would like for you to go back to the question I asked about how technically we're talking about delivering this. So we're assuming wireless is a competitor, and that's going to drive down prices. I'm assuming the other competitor in most of these areas is DSL.
And a lot of it's a wire phone company
Okay.
that currently provides DSL. Though I actually really don't like the current system. But the reason I don't like the current system is it creates a rural-rural divide. And that's one problem I have with it. Another problem I have with it is it, in my view, creates a far greater priority for connecting real estate than it does for connecting people.
Okay.
And with all respect, I think that the actual consequence of what you're doing would exacerbate that. And I think that's at least in my view, a big problem. The rural-rural divide has to do with the fact that the way we fund current universal service, we fund on the basis of the nature of the company, not on the nature of the problem. And what this results in, we have a system which guarantees certain companies who frankly are subscale, that is to say we pay them essentially to be inefficient, and we guarantee that they will get a return on whatever they invest in a way that I think should be philosophically anathema to any principled conservative or Republican or liberal, frankly. And the result of it is we effectively pay them to produce a Maserati. We only require them to produce a Mercedes. Because of the subsidy is so great, they only have to charge for a Chevy. That's for half of rural America. For the other half of rural America, we say walk.
Right.
That's an indefensible system in my view, and we propose changes in it. They're kind of complicated and wonky, but
So I want to take you guys a little bit outside of USF reform,
Yeah.
because I know that the West Coast audience and the people who are building devices and applications, they care about speed.
Right.
And maybe they don't care that it's 100 versus, actually they care that it's 100 versus 4. I'm sure they'd accept 20.
But again, they shouldn't care about the 5%. What they care about is having an adequate market for really high-speed applications. Sure. And that's why the 100 megabits is an important goal. But the government doesn't have to subsidize to get there, I don't
right.
think.
And you're right, they don't. We're getting there. But I would argue that as a citizen, as someone who would like not to have a huge digital divide, I mean...
But the digital divide today is... Here's an important point. We have a system today where Bill Gates' second home is getting a subsidy, and it is being paid for by poor people. That's not, in my view, acceptable, right? Frankly, I don't think your solution solves that. I'd like to focus more attention. We have in this country what I think of as a short-term problem, but a very significant one, of order of magnitude 80 to 100 million Americans who aren't getting broadband, but who have access to it. And why aren't they on there? Now, there's a variety of different reasons. Some of them don't trouble me at all. Seniors who don't want to be on, that's their business. But when you have a kid in a school, all of whose classmates are doing their homework on the internet, and that kid doesn't have access to it, that takes a kid who's probably already at a big disadvantage, puts them at a bigger disadvantage. When you have someone who is looking for a job, wants to do job training, and by the way, this is not about network speed. The network speeds are perfectly adequate to do the job training in most communities at this point. But they can't search for a job, do the job training in their home, because they don't know how to use a device. That's a problem. We're not spending what we need to be spending on that. So I completely agree that we need more speed in this country. That's a complicated thing. I'm happy to chat about it. But I would like to focus more attention on people.
Okay, so people, and I want to go back to the idea that with the 4 up, 1 down, I'm sorry, 4 down, 1 up. I always do that. The idea that wireless is competitive, because that's a huge component of the National Broadband Plan, and one that...
Competitive?
That wireless for rural will
Right.
be competitive with DSL and wireline broadband. Because when I look at what I choose to do on my wire, like on my MiFi, which is 3G, not 4G,
right.
one day, and what I pay for it versus my wireline and the limitations on it, and I'm not even talking about wireless net neutrality, although we could go there, and that would be like throwing a bomb in this discussion. But just from a price perspective,
Yeah.
saying to someone, you can have an e-textbook on an LTE connection that gets you 5 down, but you can only use 5 gigabytes of it per month, that's not a competitive solution. And how are we going to address that?
I think there are a couple things, but again, we have to distinguish between markets. If we're talking about will wireless compete with wired in the broadband thing, that's a really interesting question to which I don't feel that I know the answer, because you're projecting about the future. I have a hunch, but I'm not sure.
I'm not projecting. I face this debate right now. I mean, I'm sitting here.
Yeah, but you don't know whether 4G plus new technologies will make wireless more competitive. Now, there is some anecdotal evidence from other countries that as you move to 4G, wireless does compete against low-end DSL. And indeed, I can remember when I was at
on
the
price or on performance?
Well, in terms of customer preference, there are customers in other countries.
Are those low-income customers?
No.
Okay, that's the issue.
Well, I actually don't know that I broke it down, but there was cord cutting on broadband.
Sure.
When I can remember being at the FCC in '94, where the notion that 30% of Americans would simply cut the wireline phone, that was unthinkable, right? But this is the wonders of technology. I don't know whether that will ever happen with broadband. There really are very different kinds of products. But I don't dismiss the possibility. There are a lot of things that could happen that would do that. But the question you're asking, I think, is what should be the technical parameters for a federal government subsidy to largely rural America? Mm-hmm. And what we're talking about here, I think, is the last 5%. Question is, what should that government subsidy do? And that's a question of trade-offs. And one of the things I'm proudest of was at least you all know what the trade-offs are, right? If you want to have 4, it's going to cost this. But if you want to have 6, if you want to go up, that's fine. But then someone's got to explain to me how we get the money.
So can we talk a little bit about that? Because the broadband plan was somewhat sparse in details about how you pay for USF.
No,
so
actually
you talked a little bit about broadening the base of contributors. So, or maybe I just missed it. So would you like to talk a little bit about how you would reform the payment side into USF?
So what we did was we did a lot of different modeling. On the 4.1, when we did the modeling, it said it would cost approximately $33 billion over a 10-year period. That's both CapEx and OpEx for 10 years to do that, to do 4 down, 1 up. The revenues produced by those systems would be approximately 9. That leaves a private investment gap of about 24. One of the most interesting statistics to me that came out of it was that if you look at the last this is about 7 million homes. If you look at the last 250,000 homes, it's about 14 billion of it. Huge cost to it. And we were comfortable saying, look, we just think that ought to be, addressed later or done by satellite or some other thing. We're just not going to have a plan for that. One can argue about it. And then as to so we had about a gap of about 10 billion, and we produced ideas to cut about 15 billion from the existing system over a 10-year period, which would pay for what we suggested to do, as well as some other things, reforming intercarrier comp, increasing E-rates, some other kinds of things. So we were very specific as to what we would do. Again, I'm not saying we have it exactly right. There are policy preferences here. But if you want to increase the speed, understand this, you got to come up with the money. And people can say, I'm happy with my taxes. Now let me just say, it's not my preference, but there will not be, in my view, a likely congressional appropriation for this, right? I can also say with some certainty that no commissioner will raise their hand and say, I want to increase the contribution factor. Now, one alternative is to increase is to broaden the contribution base. But that's merely, you're doing the same thing. The question is, what's the amount that we're going to spend annually? So we took it at our charge is to produce a plan that within the existing amount would solve what we saw was the problem. But if people want to be specific about how they would change those preferences, that's great.
So when you say broadening the base, then does that mean then I pay USF now on my phone bill? Does that mean I pay it on my broadband bill too?
Well,
Do I pay a separate charge for that?
I will tell you that we very consciously said what we need to do is reform the existing expenditures before we reform how you collect it. And there are a lot of different reasons for that. But we had a 10-year plan in phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3. We did not go into the details about how you would reform the contribution base, as much as what we really wanted to focus on in our limited time and with our limited resources was what is in the existing system that in our view was not really producing a valuable result. For example, rate of return regulation results in some places $20,000 a line per year. We just didn't think that was appropriate. The current system produces subsidizing up to like 12 different providers in some areas. Didn't really see the benefit of that. So that was where our focus was.
Can I jump in here for a second? Because I want to introduce this thing that you touched on a little bit ago, which was competitiveness. I think one of our biggest problems, the heart of our problem in many cases, in many communities, is the lack of competition. And I think that we really haven't addressed that at its heart. We talk about it, there's a bunch of references to competition in the broadband plan. But if I go out and I talk to 100 communities, I have done needs assessment in communities. I've written about this forever and ever and a day, even sent out several surveys to economic development professionals. Right? When you let people loose to just say, what is it, what's the nature of your problem, people come back with, it's about competition. And it's not that there aren't providers in an area. I did one needs assessment where there were 12 providers in an area. But for the business community, the people in that business area, the problem was there was no competition at the speed at which they needed to do business. They had, they had some T1 choices. They had 2 major incumbents that wouldn't bring broadband into the community. Right? I look at a place like Reedsburg, Wisconsin. I look at a number of the communities that have built networks, Monticello, Minnesota. Okay, in all of those cases, there is not broadband. And everyone's, it's going to cost us all this money to bring it in, and it's going to cost you so much per month, and people are like, we can't afford that. But then let one community start talking about, we're going to build our own, and then all of a sudden the world becomes very competitive. I was talking with the marketing director at in Reedsburg for their network, their community network, right? Every month there's some new promotion for, this package, that price, whereas before them, this did not exist, right? There are a couple items in the broadband plan that talks about we're going to support, community broadband, removing the laws in the various states that prohibit community broadband. However, in all these discussions and all these various things I've watched come out of Washington, I don't see anyone actually aggressively picking up that flag and going to what I see is the heart of the problem. I'm not saying that the broadband plan didn't address it.
No, but what would you do? What's your policy for competition? What are you proposing?
Allow communities to be an active player.
Well, we did that.
No, I understand.
At least we proposed it.
Right. Well, that's what I'm saying. It's in the plan. Not a whole lot of talking about this going on.
Yeah. That's true.
When I talked about the reviving these distribution mechanisms so that communities go out and say, we have X amount of money allocated, or we're going to make a proposal to build a network, and we're going to open this up to competition, right? As opposed to we're just subsidizing the carriers, right? You make it so that the communities force a competitive environment. You force it urban, you force it rural.
But you force it by having the community offer its own network.
Right.
Or the community has a situation in which they can say, this is what we want. It's like the community, that I did this work for when they said, we have 12 providers in our area, right? We want to put out an RFP that says this is what we want to achieve. Now, who here, out of all of you folks that are providers, can help us do that? These are our speed requirements. These are our business requirements. Can someone here solve our problem?
That's what we do with E-rate and rural health today.
I understand. I'm not arguing the point. I'm saying there needs to be more of it, and that's what I'm not hearing. People seem to want to run away. The other thing is open access networks. We have no...
Wait, Craig, if Congress were to create a law that removed all of the statewide laws that said you can't build municipal networks, would that solve a big problem, maybe to the extent that you don't then take USF kind of monies and give them to communities? I mean, would that be enough to say...
You change the dynamic,
Okay.
right? If a community, okay, take the Google. Okay, so Google says we are going to, give some lucky community a gigabit network. So 1,100 communities get together. They form committees and a whole slew of stuff in each community to develop a broadband plan, a local plan that they want to get funded. Right? They define the need, they define the technology, they identify vendors, the whole 9 yards. Right? So everybody knows that Google, their chance of getting a network is slim. 1 in 1,100. All right,
3 in 1,100.
But maybe. But the real issue is those communities now, because they have looked at this from a different angle, says, okay, we can get local investors, we can get state grants. We have a measure that's being introduced in the Senate for the SBA to support small businesses with broadband. So this exercise of I am now going to define our needs and then go get money from wherever changes this equation about who's going to pay for it and how much it's going to cost. Because maybe instead of then coming to the government for $500,000, they come to the government for $100,000 because within that community they have identified other financial sources. So you change the dynamic of what does each network cost, right? This is a change. This is like a wholly different way of looking at things, but that's the dynamic you bring into the picture when you say communities can build their own. Communities can have yay or nay vote over who gets money. Right? It doesn't even have to be the community has to own the network, but by virtue of them saying, okay, we're going to get X number of dollars, who out there is going to provide? We create a competitive environment, right? And in those cases where communities build network, another thing where I'm seeing that is indeed inspiring competition is when a community builds an open access infrastructure, right? So Ontario County, New York is a prime example. I think it was $5 million to build a countywide open infrastructure. They pay for it over 25 years so it doesn't break the bank. They didn't ask for any stimulus money. They basically work that out on their own. Then what they say to all of the providers, Verizon, local providers, so forth and so on, you come in and you offer a service to our community. And the dynamic of that changes the whole equation because now you have competition because you've taken the providers out of the infrastructure business. You have turned it over to the communities that they now own that as an asset and they basically demand. They don't have that demand. Just by virtue of inviting 4, 5, 6 people to play on that network changes the whole competitive structure, changes pricing, it changes what services are offered.
Okay.
I
was going to ask you a question from Twitter.
Oh.
Can I just say
Okay.
there is a proposal in the plan, the UCAN proposal, that allows the community to aggregate demand, essentially do that kind of thing. Other than allowing them to use what they get from the federal government in that combined way as opposed to the smokestack way, and changing laws to prohibit it, what else would you have had the plan propose?
Well, I think the plan actually goes in that direction. What it says is, look at other government entities, RUS, Small Business Association, and like I said, there's a bill that's being talked about in the Senate, or it may actually be introduced, where they're basically asking the Small Business Association to create funding to support small businesses getting broadband. So that unifying all of these federal efforts, right? There are all kinds of things I'm sure coming out of the health agency side of things, right? Instead of them being silos of money.
But it's in the plan.
I'm not saying it's not.
All right, guys. We're going to get some audience participation.
Hot damn.
You guys actually, too. I'm going to look up from the iPad in a second, but this is on this topic. Successful community networks already exist.
Yep.
Should they be allowed to apply to get USF grants?
I have no objection to that.
Okay, that might work. And then,
wait, let me interject a point though. In the what is it? The thing for rulemaking, a proposal for rulemaking, released in October. They talked about setting up this mobility fund, but in the in that verbiage, it says that providers Only providers will be eligible to apply for that money, which seems to knock out this idea that communities would be open for it, unless somewhere further in this overall process there is a plan to do that. But that particular documentation was very explicit, saying it's providers.
Well, maybe
Okay.
you need to go talk to the
Yeah.
FCC while you're in town and go
Get
talk to them
communities
about
in
that.
there.
I'll be there tomorrow.
Good.
So do we have questions from the audience too? Do we have a microphone, or how's that work?
Oh, we have one from.
Oh, we have one from Sasha. I guess he gets preference since he's in the front row.
There's no rule about that, but thank you. So my question is pretty simple. I actually, I think Blair and I agree that one of the most pressing problems is how do you pay for building out broadband. If we had a big sack of money, we would say, great, let's do it all. I'm curious, because I haven't myself seen this. Do you know of, or has the FCC, or is there some secret analysis looking at the opportunity costs? I.e., what is the cost of not making this investment?
Yeah, it's a
Because
great question.
It's one thing if it's like it's going to cost us $430 billion,
Right.
but that'll save us $2 trillion
Right.
to our economy over the next 10 years. And I haven't seen that, so I'd love
Yeah.
your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, I think I would say, as a preliminary matter, that whatever we proposed, we always had in the mind, if we're talking about an expense, we had to find a source or something like that. I mean, that was just part of the planning process, as it would be in any business. I'm not sure I would agree that deployment is the number one problem, because again, I think in terms of, as we think about where the gaps are, certainly to make sure everybody has access to a baseline network, that's a very important problem. But to your specific question about what the opportunity costs are, there are a number of studies which suggest it, which frankly, I had very hardcore economists working on the team. It was fantastic in the sense that they all represented very different points of view. But when they looked at a lot of the studies that suggested huge numbers of savings or things like that, they were all deeply flawed in some way or another. It's really a big problem, and I don't know that we can actually solve it, because I think it goes to that Donald Rumsfeld notion of the known knowns and unknown things. And it also goes to the problem of whenever there's a new innovation technology, it's very hard to actually gauge its real impact. There was a wonderful piece by a Stanford economics professor named Paul David called A Computer in the Dynamo, written at a time in the early 90s, I think, when we could not see what the benefits of computers were, but all businesses were buying them and linking them, etc. And he pointed out that if you look at studies of the impact of electricity in the early era of electricity, 1880, 1890, 1910, the statistics were just, you couldn't see them. And indeed, people utilized electricity not nearly, it took 40 years for 50% of the factories to utilize central electricity. So I agree with the kind of the concept. You and I probably are in agreement that there's a lot of cost to be saved. But frankly, right now, if I was going to be spending money, I'd be spending it on how do we move education to a digital platform? How do we move healthcare to a digital platform? How do we move public safety to a digital platform? I think there are huge savings to be involved with moving a lot of government operations to a digital savings. And that would in fact drive adoption, and then that would in fact drive network upgrades. Rather than saying, let us focus $300 billion on the last 5 or 10% of the country, because I don't think it would have the same impact.
So
But look, reasonable minds can differ, and there's a lot of, you can't, it's like, who knew what the iPad would do, right? Which is, by the way, is one of the reasons why we focus so much on Spectrum, because that's one you could see really being important in the future.
I have an add-on to that, because I think this theme has come up several times today, which is, who's going to pay for it? And I think it comes from the perspective of, does the government make some pool of cash available to fund these projects? I think that when we reverse it, we take the Google approach and say, what would you do if you, as a community, be it county, city, whatever, what would you do if you had the broadband network of your dreams? And then let them percolate over that and see the various solutions. Because what I have seen over and over again is when communities do that, when they are inspired to create their own, they find their own sources of revenue.
But then why do you need the federal government? That's great. Why not let the communities do that? I'm totally for that.
I think, well, there's a question, but you're basically arguing, you're saying instead of pushing the supply, you're pushing the demand. And
I agree demand is underrated and we should be over-indexing for demand. Yes.
Okay. And Craig, I think, and most of the people who focus on broadband competition feel like there is a supply, but the lack of real solid competition, like real competition, or maybe it's in the tech community who's used to much more faster innovation, that supply side isn't keeping up with the demand on the consumer side.
It's a really serious problem. Though we can chat about it if you want, or we can take the question.
But
I would quickly
question.
just say, if people want competition, the question is what are the proposals, and would they in fact have that impact? And there were certain proposals where people said this would bring more competition, and we looked at it and we said it would have actually the opposite impact. It would slow down networks.
Michael Calabrese, New America Foundation. Well, a couple questions I think aimed primarily at Blair, but before you vote. First, the president in the State of the Union said put forward this goal, 98% wireless coverage.
Yeah.
A year, Blair, in the National Broadband Plan, as you know, you said we achieved that a year ago.
He said 98% 4G coverage.
Which 4G?
Yes. I believe there's a speech on Thursday in which he'll be more detailed about that.
So.
And the other, and then actually the main question I had was, you said earlier, and I completely agree that particularly when you think about low income and equal opportunity, that the biggest problem isn't, by far isn't internet access or speeds, it's adoption.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, how either of you see within USF reform, in particular, but maybe some other ways, an opportunity to shift some of the funding over to adoption programs, as opposed to just, reorganizing the way we pay companies, for infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So is there, I don't think the National Broadband Plan had a lot on that, but do you see an opening here, or is that a political bridge too far to actually, use some of the money for adoption programs? Because we see with the E-rate, for example, that even the modest amount that goes to libraries, and turns them into community technology centers has gone a long way.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, libraries are very unevenly spread,
Mm-hmm.
Across the population.
Yeah.
Well, my take is that the cities, I've spoken with the former CIO here in Washington. I've spoken with folks in Philadelphia and Oakland. And the issue with adoption, you're right, seems to not be an issue of is there infrastructure or service available. It is the cost of that service. And there are, I think, several ways of addressing that. I brought up earlier the whole thing of you aggregate your money and you come up with a solution, and the solution may very well not be, everyone getting service from a provider. They build their own, intra-community network, similar to what San Francisco's housing authority did. Philadelphia's housing authority proposed a similar proposal where basically you create mini infrastructure that is community owned, and then that's how you provide access. That's how you facilitate adoption, along with a slew of other programs that have to go along with that. You cannot just give people money to get online and assume that you have solved their broadband need. You have solved the issue of are they connected or not, but that's really not the problem. The problem is what do they do with that? Another sort of tack on how to address this, though I don't think it will happen from the federal level down, is a number of economic development professionals that I surveyed said what you do is you set up programs to teach low-income people how to develop wealth. And that's somewhat from left field, but what they're basically saying is if you've got low-income kids, show them how to use the internet to make money, and give them the resources to develop those skills, and that drives adoption. That pulls them out of the place that they're in. Same way with people who have retired, people on disability, people who are out of work. So we're focusing on, let's get them connected. What's the program? And again, that's not necessarily a government mandated or funded program, but I think it is definitely a government encouraged program that you support with whatever agencies that you can.
Two quick responses. First, it's so interesting to have a question from you that doesn't have the word white spaces in it. That's a private joke, but I believe it is the first time you've ever asked me a question that didn't have the word white spaces in it. Second, I think it's one of the most important gaps that we identified. I'm not sure our answer in the plan was adequate. I'm currently working. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this problem. I think I'm scheduled to give a speech in about a month on a kind of a different way of thinking about it. Whether I actually have a better idea than what's in the plan or not, I do hope that there are a lot of people who are working on this and doing really good work, but I don't think our response at this moment in time is adequate, and it's something that I certainly hope we can do better at. But let me talk about that. Spend a whole long period talking about that when that issue comes up.
We've got a question there, and
thank you. Jennifer Gatt with Jennifer Speaks and Politic365.com. So the beauty of the internet and Twitter is that I can look at my BlackBerry and know that at a concurrent event right now, across the street or down the street, at the ITIF, Chairman Janikowski was just now asked the question, why isn't universal service contributions included in the pending USF intercarrier compensation NPRM that's going to come out. And it's
what was his answer?
I don't know. No one tweeted the answer, but it's interesting also that you mentioned that no commissioner would touch that with the 10-foot pole. So I just want to know why and just discuss that a little bit more. Thanks.
Why would no commissioner touch that?
Oh no, just generally just discuss just intercarrier increasing the USF contributions as a solution.
Why do I say that?
Yeah.
Because it's true. I mean, look, I spent a lot of years as an analyst in which my own views on any subject were irrelevant. I simply reported to Wall Street what I thought would happen and what its consequences are. So I'm just reporting to you that I believe that no commissioner of the FCC will raise their hand and say, I vote to increase the contribution factor.
So is that why it's always so incredibly difficult to get answers about what the contribution factor is going to be or how you're going to change these things as we're moving forward? Because it's been very difficult in the past as a reporter to find out what this is actually going to mean for consumers.
Right. Well, the interesting thing is, of course, the contribution factor goes up. I'm just saying no one will take a vote in which the relationship between that vote and it going up is as obvious as other things. But acquiescence in the current system is a way of allowing the contribution factor to go up without ever voting for it.
Okay. So I know that you've got a question. I'm going to ask a quick one from Twitter that should be very fast. And it is, when you're talking about 4 up.
Yeah, 4 down.
4 down, again. 4 down, 1 up. For wireless, are you talking about at the base station or everywhere?
That's a great question. I think that's one that when the FCC does the NPRM, they need to find it. But it would actually be the service received in the device.
Okay.
My name is Laura Breeden. I work at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration on the broadband stimulus grants. And the particular part that I work on is the grants to cities, towns, nonprofits, and so forth for public computer centers and sustainable adoption. So I'm very interested in these issues from a really boots-on-the-ground point of view. And I have a couple of observations based on what we're seeing so far in terms of adoption and demand for adoption. So household adoption, low-income people who can't afford service, who don't know how to use the devices, who don't perceive that there is a reason for them to use the internet, there's one set of problems. But there's a very interesting, and we're working on those through the grantees, who had some really terrific ideas about how to do that. There's another whole set of problems where I think government is really getting in the way and could be much more effective than it is, and that is around institutional adoption. So you talked about healthcare, you talked about education. both of those are areas where government policy has a tremendous effect on where the money goes,
Right.
on what's allowable, on what's not allowable, on what gets measured.
Yes.
And it's amazing to me that the FCC put money into, for example, these pilot rural health networks with no funding for equipment, with no funding for training, with no funding for services, so there are these huge gaps in government programs and between programs, as well as the cultural barriers that you're up against in some fields like medicine. And I'd be really interested, since you've both looked at this from the community level and from the national level, in what you think we could do as government to reduce some of these barriers, move some of these cultural changes along a little bit faster, and get some of the big issues like Medicare won't pay for it or Medicaid won't pay for it out of the way.
Yeah. I'm really glad you raised the question. And first of all, give my regards to everyone who's there who are, really the boots on the ground are really important. It's important that people who deal with these things at a kind of high level of generalities understand the actual what you guys are actually doing. I would say very quickly that one of the big differences I have with Craig's critique of the plan is it ignores what we thought of as the second half of the book, which is the national purposes part, which from an historic perspective, I think 10 years from now we'll see is probably more important than the first part. Maybe not. There's some important things in the first part too. But your point about the ecosystem is really, really important. And while I'm really proud of the work that I did and the team that I worked with did on the E-rate, there's no question that as we look back, if we could have politically accomplished it, it would have been much better to have a kind of an ecosystem point of view as opposed to simply a connectivity point of view. There are a lot of things the administration is doing at HHS in terms of the medical healthcare IT that I think is profoundly great, and hopefully will work out. And in conjunction with what the FCC is doing is really good. And I think that the point is a lot of the recommendations in the second half of the book are about removing barriers to exactly the kind of thing that you were talking about. I don't have time to detail all of them now, but I certainly agree in principle. But same thing could be said about healthcare. Same thing can be said about public safety. We have to approach these problems completely differently. Peter Drucker, the great business visionary, said that danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence. It is to respond with yesterday's logic. And I think that if you look at a lot of, particularly kind of state rules, frankly, in terms of how they reimburse on medical or education, et cetera, there are a lot of rules where we just need to get rid of things. I was delighted, by the way, to see the state of Georgia at least proposing to eliminate textbooks, because that's a way of, in placing with ebooks, because that's an example of how a state is responding with today's logic as opposed to yesterday's logic.
I have an add-on to that as well. I don't know, maybe the question should be asked, how much are the agencies getting or defining their programs based on feedback from the communities? And for two examples, on the E-rate side of things, right? E-rate is fairly structured, even with the latest reform, to be used for with limitations on how you can use it, who you can buy services from, so forth. It's now opened up so that these folks can access dark fiber. But in talking to school administrators and also talking to people within communities, it seems like the best solution is one in which the parents are made part of the network. It's not just for students, because the way the software and the technology is designed, parents could participate in their kids' online education experience, but there's a barrier between where the technology can go and where it's needed, where if you were responding to communities, you wouldn't have this problem. Or if I look at the healthcare, right, the FCC had a number of pilot projects for the part of E-rate that deals with healthcare services, right? Well, I was at a conference of community stakeholders from various counties in rural California who were thoroughly surprised that such a program existed, and money had been awarded to AT&T for that project, because they didn't feel like they knew about it, they were consulted. Why weren't local service providers made a part of the project? Because they are more in tune with what the needs are. You know, it kind of comes back to this, you know, are we developing projects and programs here and then trying to make those fit? Or are we allowing for some element of contribution to the solution at the community level? And I think if we don't get to that latter point, we're going to have more wasted money and programs that reach half of their potential or some portion of it.
Okay, I think we're almost out of time. Laura, I kind of wanted to ask, since smartphones are such a big deal, and I think a lot of people think of broadband adoption as still coming from a laptop or even, God forbid, a PC. Do you guys have any programs that are like delivering Wi-Fi routers to people as part of their broadband package so they can move off of like a 3G network onto their home broadband connection, and maybe that's a way to get people to use it?
Are you asking me?
Yes, yeah. Because you seem to know about this.
Yeah, there are a number of, we have programs where either housing is being set up with wireless networks, which will cover the entire footprint of the housing project, or the units themselves are being wired. So we have both kinds of projects there. And we are not so engaged in community wireless, mostly because we didn't get a lot of proposals to do that. But we are engaged in a number of places, and our single largest sustainable adoption project, which is Grant to One Economy Corporation, is almost entirely based on wireless networks in public housing.
And if I can just add a couple of things very quickly, that it's very interesting to look at the statistics about adoption. In terms of wireline, the kind of low income, the gap, the digital divide there is pretty remarkable. It's much less among wireless, and I think that goes to the question of, is it competitive? And that's a question answered not by technology and not by those kind of metrics, but by actual consumer, you know, what do consumers actually do? You could say that the quality of voice in a wireless phone is much less than a wired, and that would be true, but consumers are kind of choosing to cut the cord, and to a certain way there's a preference being established. I would just also, we didn't really focus on the politics or the PR of the plan. We had to focus very much on what was a good plan, what was a plan that was sustainable, and people could read it over time and say, okay, this helps us develop the way. One of the few places we actually asked for a new appropriation, other than Public Safety Network, was for libraries. They are doing a fantastic job. They have become computing centers. It's interesting. In the mid-'90s, I thought libraries would be obsolete. They're now, in some ways, more relevant than ever. But because they serve that function, and you know, look, I wish Congress. It's one place I think Congress should really appropriate some money. I don't believe they're going to, but would that it would be so, because of that service that they offer as an institutional provider for a community.
Great.
All right.
Well, I think we're out of time, actually.
I think we are, and yeah. All right. Well, thank you guys so much.
Great.
Thanks very much for our guests.